Und wir
Go over there and have a seat, and we will start our panel discussion. There are two more guests, Mrs. Katharina Utermöhl.
Katharina Utermöhl, sie ist
Katharina Utermöhl. She is an economist by training and works at Allianz SE.
Zorn, ist Ökonom.
And Armand Zorn. He's a member of the Bundestag, and he's a member of the Finance Committee and the deputy spokesperson of the Finance Working Group of the SPD Parliamentary Group.
Jetzt könnten wir gleich mit den structural changes anfangen, die Herr Tooze vorgestellt
hat. So we could start by discussing the structural changes mentioned by Mr. Tooze. But I would like to comment on what Mr. Tooze has just said, an additional 75
Das hörte sich ja ebenso an, als
points.
Einfach immer das, was die USA machen, und dann sind wir jetzt.
So usually he says we do what the United States are doing, so have we already priced that in, so it won't matter any longer, or
Wellen geschlagen.
This had an impact on economics. Do you think that there will be an impact? And what will this impact be? I hope my microphone is working as well. I would have loved to listen to you much longer. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Ja, zur EZB,
as far as the ECB is concerned,
diesen 75-Basis-Club auch beitreten, weil sie
they have to announce the 0.75%, and if they don't meet the market expectations, this would have been a burden for the euro, and then this might have led to surging energy prices, and then there would have been another increase in base rates later on if they hadn't done so. The question is, who's the biggest hawk? And I think, well, it might go on like this until we're going to see a recession, because I agree there will be a recession by the end of the year. I'm sure we will reach about 2%. And
soll ich auch was dazu sagen? Ja, also ich glaube, der Schritt heute war...
Well,
einschätzen darf, würde aber grundsätzlich.
I believe that this was the right step to take, but nevertheless, I think, well, these are the limits of what fiscal policy in Europe can do, and Professor Tooze has explained this very well, and this is what I also said in my speeches to the Bundestag. This crisis cannot be solved by fiscal policy only. We have entered into a crisis that started a number of years ago, and now the ECB is under a lot of pressure, and people expect them to use new instruments or tools or increasing interest rates, and this might be justified looking at 0% interest rates. I don't know whether 2% or 2.5% are the right thing to do, but fiscal policy alone cannot be the solution to this crisis.
Hier schon wieder ein sogenanntes Game of Chicken ausgebrochen ist.
Well, one interpretation might be that there is a game of chicken. This is a well-known James Dean film.
Bremst zuerst.
Two cars having a chicken race, and if there is a game of chicken, well, the ECB will raise interest rates until there will be a reform of the energy sector in Europe, putting a brake to prices. There is a tradition that we have seen. Jean-Claude Juncker, for example, well, he had a systematical chicken race for a number of years. He wanted to see reforms, and only afterwards the ECB was prepared to enter into the market buying bonds. This is why Draghi said, I will do whatever it takes. So always said this is a turning era, and
das ist, glaube ich, das
I think This is exactly the game we are playing now, because the ECB definitely agrees with you. This is not a problem that they can solve, but they need governments to take action in order to help them putting on the brake, because they need to respond. If there is an inflation of 8% and real interest rates are quite complex, let's say we achieve 2 or 2.5% and inflation goes down to 7%, then the actual interest rate is minus 5%. So they cannot remain passive. This is not something they can afford to do. And you need to bear in mind that they have used this protection instrument in order to take Italy off the table. And of course, hawks are demanding more action. Of course, they cannot do this again in autumn, because there will be bad news in autumn, so it will getting more complex. So they have this window of opportunity and they have to do it right now, and afterwards they can take a softer approach. This is what I would hope for. Christine Lagarde said today, we cannot do anything about the problem, because the steps that we are going to take will not help to reduce inflation going down to 2%. But this is also about expectations management, and they need to do something about it, because their credibility is at stake. Even if there's two-digit inflation, they cannot go on with the same fiscal policy. But in this case, it was not only the United States doing the same thing, but the ECB, they, want different things, and maybe the result would be the same. Maybe they should have taken 77 points. But I would like to talk about the last idea of Mr. Tooze, relief packages and small measures will not help us, and we need structural change. We need to do more. And Mrs. Utermöhl, you said a very similar thing. What does it actually mean? What kind of structural changes do we need? And the other question that I have is, let's say there is this relief package, but we need structural change, and this will take a long time to do this in Germany, then it will not be working out. So this is a question to you.
Strukturelle Veränderungen, ja, das dauert in Deutschland normalerweise.
Yes, structural changes take time in Germany. Unfortunately, that is not a good scenario. I'm afraid that for the German economy, there will be a rather abrupt structural change. And I didn't want to come up with the apocalyptic scenario. And thank you for taking that over. But I think this crisis will hit us more than the euro crisis. It will hit us more than the large financial crisis. I think there will be structural headwind. We will have higher energy prices. We will also have higher interest rates. There'll be more global uncertainty, which is not very conducive to global trade. And what we're going to see this winter, potential production stops. I think this is just the beginning, because I do not expect that energy prices will drop again dramatically next year. I think we have to assume that this is a long-term crisis. It's not like COVID that had a limited duration, but this will be a long-term crisis. And that's why structural change needs to happen very soon. The question is now, what can politics do? My feeling is that policymakers feel overtasked at the moment. At the moment, we're just putting Band-Aid on everything. And we're just trying to deal with the current pain that people feel. But if there is going to be a recession, And if you realize that we are weaker after the crisis, then I think we need to come up with more fundamental answers. Okay, could you give me an example of a structural change that would need to take place now?
Ich glaube, es sind strukturelle Veränderungen, die stattfinden.
Once again, structural changes will happen, like, for example, energy-intensive industries might not have a future here or may want to relocate, for example, in the US, that are not as hard hit by the energy shock. And then we, as a country, need to deal with that. We need to invest in activities that have a higher added value. That means we need to move up to other areas, invest more in green technologies. And perhaps we don't have to produce steel in Germany anymore, which will become impossible anyway with the high energy prices, unless it's green steel. But for that to happen, we need to invest. And we're not really investing much now, which is, of course, always difficult when you're in a crisis.
Teil der Ampelkoalition das tun.
I would say as part of the government coalition, we are doing this. We look at the different areas, and the professor described all of this.
Für die hohen Preise. Auch im Deutschen Bundestag gibt es dadurch.
And I think we agreed on the reasons for the high prices we're seeing now.
Energiesektor rausnehmen, die hohen
If in Germany we focus on the energy sector and high energy prices,
kurzfristig Entlastung.
then we're doing something to stop this. We have the relief packages, and yes, of course, they are not about structural change, but the goal is to offer, in a targeted way, support to those people and those companies that suffer most from the high energy prices. And this is something we're fixing now with the relief packages. And to be sure, not everything is perfect, and maybe the targeting is not perfect, but we are doing something. And yes, we do need structural change, and we're working on it. We know that gas prices were way too low in the past, and we know that. And we have a very intensive energy industry here in Europe. We want to phase out of energy-intensive industries, and that's very clear in our coalition agreement. We are now on the way to promoting the expansion of renewables. And of course, that's not going to be possible overnight here in Germany, but we are in the process of accelerating approval procedures and so on. And in the medium and long term, the goal is to use more renewables. That's not only good for the environment, it will also cost less. But then there will be a transition phase between the short-term support and the long-term goals. But there too, I would say, the government is quite active. The federal chancellor has said it repeatedly. We're now building the LNG terminals. That will take some time. And of course, LNG is more expensive than gas from Russia. But this is an example of what we're doing. And we are also in the process of fixing the social crisis that you mentioned. But looking at the energy prices, that is an example where you see how we're coming up with short-term, medium-term, and long-term solutions. Mr. Tooze, I wanted to ask you something. So yes, we are working on structural changes in the energy markets, but you weren't only talking about industrial transformation. Joe Biden, the US president, said, if you look for more workers, pay them better. Wouldn't that mean that in Germany we should support the trade unions more? Now, I promise to come back to your question, but let me just add a comment on energy costs, and let's call it deindustrialization. Of course, that's a word that people don't like to hear, but that's what it is. We need to take this problem very seriously, but we must not be intimidated by the lobbyists. The debate started with the boycott discussion in the spring. We had all these horrible news saying that BASF would go down if we don't have any Russian gas anymore. But then there is the cynical statement that people say the German industry was only so successful because it had access to cheap Russian gas. And there is actually no empirical proof of that. Yes, gas in Europe is more expensive than the gas in Texas, and the gas in Texas or the US costs nothing. But if you compare gas prices to Asia,
Wir müssen ja bei der Inflation bleiben, nicht zu tief in den Energie.
let's not just focus on the energy sector. Yes, but I am just pointing out what structural changes will entail.
Dass das irgendwie ein deutscher Sonderweg ist.
And although there will be a difficult impact for Germany, it's not only Germany that is affected. Other industries, other regions like East Asia, they will all suffer from the high LNG prices. The problem is they can use coal.
Die jetzt wirklich ansteht, ist, dass die CBAM-Diskussion, also die Carbon Border Adjustment.
But the carbon border adjustment discussion also needs to take place, meaning
damit müssen wir jetzt ernst
collecting a levy on CO2-intensive goods. That's something we also need to discuss if you really want to see a green revolution. But I wanted to say something else.
Wir haben hier einen Vertreter des IG Metalls präsent.
In Germany, actually, there is somebody from the Metal Workers Union here in Germany, and the trade unions are still going strong in Germany. They are able to carry out collective negotiations. In the US, there is no such system, and the trade unions aren't as powerful. Now, what I want to say is this. The social crises arising from inflation are not natural development. It's also a result of the weakening of the trade unions in the 1970s. And one response to inflation could be not to handle this in a top-down manner, but actually bottom-up, to use these counterforces and strengthen them. And if we do that, economic policy becomes more complicated, but it also becomes more democratic because more people have a say. And it shouldn't just be considered a fallback option, something that you might consider doing in a crisis, but there should be a general opening of the political process to more diverse interests. This all goes back to the 1960s and 70s. And if we look at the structural crisis of the left-wing parties and the social democratic parties, then that is directly connected to the weakening of the trade unions. And we see very acutely what we've lost because of that in the UK and the US. And that was my point. Why aren't we even discussing this? Yeah, I mean, but we said we're going to all work together, policymakers, the business community and trade unions, and that will fix it. But nobody talks about this collaboration anymore, right? No, I think concerted action of this type is very important because the employers and employees and policymakers all need to find solutions together. But what you're describing here, Professor, is happening. I come from Frankfurt, and perhaps you know Frankfurt Main Airport, and the collective negotiations there are very fierce. At Frankfurt Airport, we had short-time work and furlough. A lot of workers actually had a quite comfortable life, didn't work, but got most of their money, also because the airport company considered they might not need all of these people anymore. Many left the company and found other work. But now we're in a situation where the airport company finds it very difficult to rehire people. But it is true, at the moment, I think the employees realize that they are in a strengthened position and they can negotiate better wages. And that means what Mr. Tooze described is happening as we speak. But it doesn't mean that we don't need any concerted action anymore. Yes, and that is a constructive response that might help us avoid the yellow vests. And it's a better way of solving that crisis. It's about opening up new pathways of participation in society.
gewerkschaftliche
For
Organisationen
practical reasons, for historical reasons, trade unions have an important role to play.
sollte nicht
If we want to talk about populism,
der Kolonialarbeiterschaft
we shouldn't even, we should not deny the weakening of organizations like trade unions.
gemacht hat, dann ist
And if we conjure up
die Antwort darauf,
the
diese kollektive
specter of
Entscheidungsfindung
an extremist revolution, then we must make sure that these pragmatic and rational forces are being strengthened.
Doch einen wichtigen Punkt bekommen, nämlich den schönen Entlastungspaketen. Auch wenn Sie
Now, let us move on to the relief packages, although you just called them Band-Aid.
die Leute nicht sagen, irgendwie
My feeling is
der nächsten Gewerkschaft an, weil dann
not that people are saying right now, oh, let me join the trade union, because that will help me to negotiate better wages.
Rechnung nicht bezahlt.
But people just say, I can't pay my bills.
Gewerkschaftsausweis
And they take to the streets and they're asking for more money,
hat gesagt,
wherever that comes from.
Entlastungspakete machen wir das so,
And now one of the church welfare organizations said
über mehrere Monate
the lowest 10%
100 Euro pro Monat,
of our workers get 100 euros per month.
nix.
That will amount to a total of
das wäre
5.4 million. The wealthy will not get anything. Does that sound like a suitable approach to you?
Die Diakonie hat das vorgeschlagen.
Entlastungspaket 3.
Okay, now
Professor,
let's come back to relief package number 3. There's something that people sometimes forget to mention. There is something that refers to trade unions.
Arbeitnehmervertreter
We are saying here,
eine Pauschale
if the employers and employees can agree on paying a lump sum,
dafür,
then
sich in
an
Gewerkschaften
amount of up to 3,000 euros will be tax-free.
ihre Rechte
So we're opening up a way for the social partners to negotiate such a tax-free allowance.
Ich will aber noch mal
About the example you mentioned, I don't know enough about this,
besonders darauf geachtet, dass
but I can tell you that with the third relief package,
Entlastung profitiert.
we tried to make sure
So. Dass insbesondere die Menschen,
that those
die Steuererleichterung
who don't benefit from tax breaks
davon haben. Das sieht man tatsächlich im
will
Entlastung.
benefit from this package. That's very much reflected in that package. I mean, take
Bei den
pensioners,
Paketen zuvor
university students.
berücksichtigt hatten, nicht in diesem Maße
They weren't considered before,
auch teilweise jetzt
and now
betrachtet werden. Und
they also receive financial support.
als unterschätzt wahrnehme, ist die Frage,
And there's another question that we are perhaps underestimating in its importance, and that's a global minimum tax.
nicht hoch genug loben, ehrlich gesagt, weil die gesamte
I think that's a very important idea,
gerade eigentlich so ein bisschen Rückenwind verloren hat.
because this discussion about a global minimum tax had really lost some momentum.
In der Europäischen Union mit Polen und Ungarn 2 Länder gibt, die
And in Europe, with Poland and Hungary, there were 2 countries who didn't really
in Deutschland zu machen, dann belebt
budge on this topic.
globale Debatte immer wieder und sorgen eigentlich dafür, dass
So
dort
it's good that we are reviving this global debate. It might mean that we can raise more money
Abgehauen. Ich würde aber
and it will help national budgets.
und
Okay, but let's remain in Germany.
kurz angerissen und ich sage auch
There's something Mr. Graeber said earlier
Entlastungspaket. 7
about the relief package.
Milliarden der
Now, 70% of the 10
gehen an
billion
10% obere Einkommen.
connected to the coal progression go to the
Paket.
utmost 30%.
Wir können noch darüber reden, ob es groß genug ist, aber die Frage ist,
I mean, one thing is we can discuss whether the package is big enough, but the other question is it fair enough?
Eingehen direkt. Das ist ja eigentlich nicht wirklich, also ja genau.
If I may make a comment,
Wirkliche Entlastung.
ich kann ja was sagen.
this isn't really
es sind
relief, right?
70% sind 7 Milliarden, die
But it means 7 billion
stehen, um damit was
Nein,
anderes zu
that won't be available for other purposes.
Vom Entlastungspaket sein.
Well, if you ask me, I didn't want the coal progression topic in the relief package.
Weil wir dazu gesetzlich verpflichtet sind, die Kalto-Progression jährlich immer wieder anzupassen.
It's a legal requirement to adjust the coal progression rate each year.
Gesetzlich dazu verpflichtet, jedes Jahr
So by law,
zu sorgen, dass die Kalto-Progression
every 2 years,
wird. Und deswegen ist es
we
eigentlich
need to fix the coal progression
dafür,
rate.
die Menschen nicht zusätzlich belasten. Und das ist auch verfassungsrechtlich so
And we need to make sure that we don't impose a higher burden on people. But the question is whether that system is
Nee, also der andere Punkt, die Kritik, die ich gerne,
still adequate
wenn man die kalte
in the first place.
ob man eigentlich nicht mehr
Yeah, I mean, the question is, if we give up cold progression,
Geringverdiener,
wouldn't it be possible
das ist eine Kritik,
to actually give more of a relief to low earners?
die innerhalb der Koalition kämpft. Das ist, glaube ich,
This is something that my party and my parliamentary group is fighting for.
eine Mehrheit.
But unfortunately, the finance minister is not from our
Die
party.
kalte Progression fokussieren und sagen, das
I
ist,
think if we focus only on the cold progression
weil unabhängig von Entlastungspaketen
and use that to say that we're only helping the wealthy, then this is not the point.
Von dem Paket.
Ms. Utermöhl, what do you think about the relief package?
Es gibt ein paar gute Sachen dabei und
I think there are some
sein können vielleicht,
good things. Others could have been better.
die schon gelaufen sind, vielleicht wie die Mehrwertsteuer
And there are other topics like lower VAT
oder Gasumlage, in welcher Form man
or the gas levy
da würde ich sagen, die waren vielleicht auch eher kontraproduktiv.
that might have been counterproductive.
Finde ich, es gibt
But taking one step back,
3 Punkte, die es zu beachten gilt.
I think there are three things to be taken into account.
Knappheit. Wir reden viel zu wenig darüber.
First, we have a supply problem, and we don't talk about that. We only talk about relief measures,
Aber warum
and
machen wir nicht mehr?
that is understandable because the pain is very acute. But why don't we do more on the supply side by, for example, saying we need to keep all the nuclear power plants running? Why don't we use coal-fired power plants again?
Wie haben Sie eben genannt?
I mean, it's an exceptional situation.
Eine furchtbare Situation wie der vor.
And I think we can all expect that there will be a even more serious crisis in the autumn. And so why are we not discussing this? And not at some point in the future, not only as reserve energy. Why didn't we start discussing this much earlier, i.e. in April?
Alle AKWs werden bereit,
If today we were to say that all nuclear power plants
beispielsweise, oder aber auch
should be starting to once again
die Kohlekraftwerke werden
produce electricity next week,
preisdämpfend auswirken. Und das
this would already dampen the price.
wäre das schon eine direkte Entlastung.
And it would help everybody immediately.
Nee,
Yeah, but I didn't ask you about nuclear power plants. You asked about the relief package. No, but what my point is,
geht es um die
we're only talking about the relief package, but the real problem is inflation.
Impfen oder eben
And inflation can also be stopped in other ways. We can also work on the supply side to bring down prices. It's just an argument that I miss. But now back to the measures being taken as part of the package.
teilweise wird mit der Gießkanne gearbeitet.
On the demand side, there is a bit of a scatter cash approach, like, for example, the €9 ticket and its successor.
Ob das da
I mean, it's been a bestseller, but I don't know whether that was very well invested money.
zwischen Rentner ist 300 wert, Student ist
And then interestingly, you're also saying 300 go to pensioners, 200 to university students, and even less to kids.
im Endeffekt wird es ja auch die
The
junge
question is that fair?
irgendwann später.
After all, it will be the next generation to pay back all of these debts.
Das wäre noch ein anderer Punkt vielleicht. Ansonsten,
That's another comment I have.
wo es um die die Preisbremse geht, finde ich eigentlich
And then the price cap for electricity, I quite like that. It doesn't
sinnvoll.
directly interfere with the structure of that market.
Gewünscht hätte sicherlich nicht,
Because it's not ideal.
insbesondere von FDP und CDU würde ich auch sagen, aber auch in der SPD hat das wahrscheinlich vor ein paar Monaten
And I would assume that nobody in the government would have expected that such a measure will need to be taken, and I think it's a good idea.
In diesen Begriff Gesellschaftsvertrag. Gestern, glaube ich, im Interview
We talked about the social contract, and I heard Heinz Bude yesterday saying this is not about introducing relief packages, but this is about reshaping the social contract. What we need is a solidarity contract, meaning, well, those who are well off, they don't get anything, and the others get more.
was da überhaupt finanziert ist.
And the question is where the funds come from.
Solidaritätsvertrag.
Mr. Tooze, a social contract or solidarity contract, unfortunately, interpreter.
Zum Belastungspaket.
Well, as far as the relief package is concerned, this is an interesting democratic process because we haven't agreed on all the details and gas seems to be missing. Well, this is what the European Union deals with. Yes, but it's very hard to get a proper idea how big the problem actually is. Well, due to the relief package, because we need much more and we need to think bigger. And that's why we need to ask this question as to the solidarity contract. And then, of course, there's a lot of tensions because of cold progression. And cold progression might be enshrined in the law, but what is really obvious is that society as a whole will face a lot of costs, exploding costs, and this will lead to a lot of pain within our society. And the solution that we need is a solution that has to redistribute, taking it away from those who are well off and giving it to those who are worse off. So I don't proclaim myself to be in favor of the debt brake, but of course we don't need a package that is financed by deficits. But we need to ask this question regarding taxes in order to find a solution. Of course, there might be windfall taxes. This would help, and this could be a targeted measure. But we need to scale this up. But we cannot turn a blind eye to the question as to how to deal with this loss of property and distribute this loss of property. And well, I think the coalition, is not able to deal with it. They can deal with the energy transition, but I don't think that they will find a structural solution to that. The Tory government, this was very much to my surprise. They tend to be much more flexible because it's one party that is in power. They can communicate this to their voters. This might be due to the rationality of the British process. But when looking at the coalition, and this was also mentioned by Joe Stickley. Well, they are all fighting for their own interests, and this, of course, is a problem and makes it even more complex. Well, I disagree for a number of reasons. Please be brief. Yes, I try to be brief because we also want to have a Q&A session later on. If we want to be successful with the transitions, then the question is, who can provide the funds? So kudos to the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. This is really the right topic to talk about, if you ask me personally, or as a social democrat. We have a very clear party manifesto, but on the other hand, I need to deal with a political reality at hand. And, we don't have a share of 35 or 50%, but these are the three parties that were voted for, and this is not about standing out. This is really about the convictions and beliefs we have when talking to a liberal, and we trying to find out what do we need in order to promote transitions and transformations. And they say, the market will be the solution to all the problems, and they're really serious about it. And we as social democrats, of course, we have a different idea. And as far as the German system is concerned, because you use the British system as a comparison, yes, usually things take more time here, but our system is very resilient. political parties, they need to cooperate, and then we have the different länder, the federal states, and they also intervene. This means that things take longer. But on the other hand, we have a broad consensus whenever taking a decision. But the only thing you need to do is to be open about the fact that Christian Lindner knows very well that he's always trying to work around the debt break. There is no debt break. Well, maybe he doesn't have to admit it because he claims that there is a debt break, but actually there isn't. It is a way. Well, you have to distinguish between loyalty and beliefs. Sometimes they are convinced that they're doing the right thing, but the other question is it really right to say that we still have a debt break? And what do we think about a political decision maker that claims that he will see the debt break next year, putting it into praxis? But is this really credible, or is this an illusion? And that's exactly the question that we need to ask ourselves. This is, well, opinions and ideas and beliefs, this is all very well, but this is about reality. This is not a question of belief, of values, but you need to be realistic. We understand these problems, the core of these problems, and this is why we are pursuing the policy we pursue.
Werte der anderen auf der gleichen Ebene stellen, wenn sie so wenig Bodenhaftung haben, wie die Position innerhalb der Koalition.
We cannot believe in what they say because
Sie machen einen neuen
it's not really reasonable what they say. What about a new coalition agreement, an honest coalition agreement? I think I talked to Kevin Kühnert 3 months ago, and he said this just an empty shell.
Ich sehe das nicht so. Ich finde
No, I don't agree. I think this is really a very sound coalition agreement because we have seen a huge crisis that we are facing, and we need to find a way to solve this crisis. Well, sometimes I'm quite surprised by the statements of our finance minister because I'm also wondering how we can stick to this idea of our debt break, but the Liberals, they are our partners. They're not our opponents. Of course, I still have the same beliefs, but we want to find a solution with our coalition partners. There's no alternative to this, and we really need to stand up for our values, and you will realize that we account for large parts of the relief package, but of course there are some limits to that. Well, banks, of course, will realize that there's no real funding to the relief package and that it will be hard to put the coalition agreement into practice, and we don't know how to pay for it. And do you really think the coalition agreement and the coalition itself is credible? Well, I have to admit that I have a good impression of the agreement and the coalition reflecting our society, no matter the political affiliation you have. Of course, no one will be happy with all these decisions being taken, but we're in the middle of a crisis, and this may also lead to more cohesion, because there's something in for everyone. I believe that this is a good political recipe dealing with such a severe crisis and facing these challenges that I've just mentioned. So I think it's the right thing to do, and the debt brake is part of our constitution, so you can't do anything about it. So the idea is that this is an objective that needs to be reached. So the idea is to stick to it. Well, and if there will be a recession, if there's a recession, well, of course, things are different, but the idea is to have fewer fiscal impetus next year, and this will have an impact on inflation too. So the idea is to provide more funds to lower income households, but from a fiscal policy point of view, we need to do more.
Ich würde jetzt, bevor wir das Publikum einbinden, noch
And before asking our audience,
reinwerfen. Und zwar hat
I would like to ask you one more question. Isabel Schnabel at the ECB said we have great volatility, so no one actually knows what's to come. It's not only about the lack of Russian gas, no one knows whether there will be a new COVID variant, and no one knows whether supply chains in China will really hold, or maybe we have a drought next year and we won't have a shortage of wheat.
Vorbereitung eigentlich erfordert. Und die
So actually we need to prepare for that, and well, and this is not about relief package 3, 4, 5, 6 or trade unions.
Sie gehen fest von einer Rezession.
So you said there will be a recession, at least this is what you expect. What do you think do we have to face, and what can we do about it? Using relief packages, or maybe not using relief packages? Mr. Tooze, would you like to start?
Wir kehren zum alten Problem zurück. Was wir brauchen.
So we're coming back full circle. What we need is more capacity, fiscal capacities, and sound balance sheets, and that's why we need the freedom to decide. The debt brake is part of a different era, and this is the main problem. And if this is not working at a German level, we need to take this to the European level. There we have a lot of fiscal capacities because, well, European bonds sell very well, and this is the only way to give a general answer to your question, because it is very difficult to anticipate any crises. We can't go back, and we cannot start a historic consolidation process. This would be counterproductive. What we need to do is to look for crisis control and cushion mechanisms. So the foreseeable risks need to be dealt with. We need to reduce these risks. So wherever we see a risk, we need to invest in long-term measures. And we need to be prepared to be flexible in our response with a lot of clout. And as far as structural issues are concerned, this is why I mentioned the UK, is we need to act and have sovereignty when doing that. This is what the United States can do and what Japan can do. We need a fiscal union in the European Union, and this is an ever more pressing problem, and this is the only answer I can give. This is the capacity of a modern tax government. This is what Europe needs. Otherwise, we don't need to talk about sovereignty.
Ich mache mal weiter. Ich glaube auch, dass wir in den letzten 10 Jahren
I think in the past 10 years, well, this was a special decade. We have seen negative interest rates.
Das wird sich jetzt ändern. Ich glaube,
There was a lot of support for fiscal policy, so there will be rising inflation. It cannot be backed up by the ECB. This was, however, very important for Germany and other countries too. And this means
eher, sagen wir mal, straffer geführt werden muss. Ich denke, da muss man
we need stricter fiscal policy and tend to put a greater focus on
diese zu unterstützen,
investing in transformation.
dass man keine Revolution quasi hat und muss.
On the other hand, we need to, well, keep any revolutionary tendencies at bay, and we need to help people not to
Spielraum ist. Was bedeutet das denn dann? Aber
fall below the poverty line. So what does it actually mean? I think
zum einen,
there needs to be less state intervention when it comes to economics, but this applies to Germany, but it also applies to Italy. So 5% GDP will be what's at stake this year in order to fight the crisis. And since this is not a one-off event and it will take longer than this year, there will be 2 or 3% next year. Then we look at Italy. Well, there will be about 150%. And then we look at the European level. But
super niedrigen Renditen der EU? Oder warum werden der EU die Anleihen aus der Hand gerissen?
But why do European bonds sell so well? Well, this is also due to German credit worthiness.
Wer unterschreibt?
So if fiscal policy is restricted, the question is, well, who
Ich glaube, das wird kein riesiger
who can account for the credit worthiness of the European Union? So I think this will be, well, this can only be some small funds. I don't think that this is the solution, the silver bullet. So it will getting even more difficult in the future, and EU funds cannot be the solution. And
Der einzige Notbehelf.
but it's the only, well, fallback solution, the only general answer to the question, because otherwise we won't be able to have any specific answers because we do not know what to expect. This is a kind of minimum solution in order to give a broad answer to this question. Well, of course, I share your pessimistic view, and this is the last point I would like to mention. We need to strengthen the private sector. However, we need to promote innovation in order to shape this green transformation at a global level.
Ich glaube, für die nächsten Jahre
I think in the next few years to come, I think we need a strong government. There will be a transformation intertwined with a number of social challenges that we have to face. There will be a lot of companies facing difficulties, and it is important that the state is in control.
absolut gerechtfertigt.
And it's the right thing to do to have debts in order to support people and businesses. And this is what our Chancellor said. He said we will do anything that's humanly possible in order to support our people. It's very similar to the whatever it takes speech given by Draghi. Yes, prices are soaring, and this is also felt by the people.
Durchkommen werden. Das
And we cannot deny this, but the fact that we be able to make it through winter time is a success, because our gas deposits were empty when the coalition came into power. And the fact that we will be able to make it through winter, this is a success story. Prices are going up, and that's why we have the relief package, but still this is a success. And in order to answer your question, well, a state being in control, taking fiscal measures and introducing relief packages will be important. And I agree with Mr. Tooze. Even the International Monetary Fund made this suggestion that we need European bonds, that we need European debts, and there will be a lot of discussions. It's very hard to find a common denominator here, but I think this is the only way to do. We need fiscal reforms at a European level.
Wir hätten jetzt noch bei einigen Punkten in die Tiefe.
So, of course, we could have looked into greater detail, but the idea was to also take your questions. We have 2 microphones, and I would like to ask you to use a microphone. Should you have a question?
Der Herr dort hinten.
The gentleman in the back.
Und
And the lady over there.
bitte zu dem Mikro.
And
Ach so,
the young gentleman over there.
eben gerade gehabt. Tut mir
I think I pointed to you. I'm sorry.
ein bisschen schwierig.
It's a bit hard to do.
Zwei Fragen an den SPD.
I have 2 questions to a colleague from the Social Democrats. Maybe are there more people that can expect to
Weiterhin eine
the benefit of 200 or 300 euros?
die Agenda bestimmt und nicht die Partei, die
And what can we? Why is it that the Liberals are having a say here? Because it's the Social Democrats that receive most of the votes. And then I have a question to all 3 of you. The biggest crisis, of course, is climate change. And this package
alles
really has a negative impact on climate change.
Nichterhöhung der CO2-Abgabe, wie sie eigentlich geplant ist,
For example, the freeze of the CO2 levy.
rechtfertigen, dass man
So how do you justify this decision?
Ein bisschen sammeln.
So maybe we collect questions first.
Die Dame bitte.
The lady over there.
Ich bedanke mich bei der Friedrich-Ebert.
I would like to thank the Friedrich Ebert Foundation for organizing this event, and I would also like to thank Mr. Tooze
Steigerungs
for his great presentation
in den 70er entwickelt worden sind
explaining
im Fach Wirtschaftslehre und
the improvement that was made in economics since the 1970s, because in the 1970s I had to deal
einander führen kann, wie das damals der Fall war.
with the relation of business and studies and economics, and
Heute imponierenderweise entwickelt worden sind. Meine Frage,
my question is,
Sie haben immer nur argumentiert von der Makroebene aus.
you used macroeconomics
Gleichzeitig haben
as an argument, which is the right thing to do when talking about this topic. On the other hand, you also looked into the microeconomic level, but this has never been done before in economic history, because usually low-income households, they just had to deal with macroeconomic decisions, and at times where the Social Democrats had to fight during emperor's times,
führte, dass die Einkommenslage
there were just
Stiftung und der SPD keine Chancen hatten.
soldiers were just deployed in order to solve the situation, but nowadays it's still a microeconomic situation. So, and due to our educational systems, our citizens do not have the necessary skills to deal with this crisis. So my question is, the measures that you have been developing at a macroeconomic level, how can they be successful, considering regarding households that do not have the skills to be successful in the market, either as an employee or a private household? Thank you.
Mein Name ist Hans-Georg Tillmann, ich bin Rechtsanwalt und
My name is Hans-Georg Tillmann, and I've been a member of the Social Democrats since 1972.
Inflation ist eine politische Inflation.
This inflation is a political inflation, and we need 2 things. First of all, we need peace in Ukraine, so we cannot leave it to Putin and Zelensky. We need more people intervening. And the second thing is we need to normalize our relationship with Russia. maybe some people are now upset, but I would like to remind you that we find ourselves in a situation where humanity needs to make a deal with the devil, because climate change is very severe and we cannot afford to lose time or money in order for the war dragging on. So we need global cooperation instead of confrontation to save humanity.
Die Antworten. Ich habe mir notiert bei dem ersten im Prinzip, aber Herr Tooze hat schon.
Okay, now over to you, Mr. Tooze.
Auf die provokante letzte Frage sofort zum Anfang.
Perhaps I start with the last question.
Schön wäre es, wenn man
Yeah, of course it would be great.
zu einem ertragbaren
It
Ergebnis.
would be great to believe that such a strategy would lead to a sustainable result. I mean, your proposal is logical, and it's also the position of the German government and other European governments. We need a negotiated peace. The problem is that we're dealing with two countries and very asymmetrical power relations. And I don't think Russia will accept a solution that is beneficial to Ukraine if he's not forced. And Ukraine basically depends on us and depends on Ukraine. So we can force them to negotiate a peace, but the question is whether that's what we want. At the moment, we don't. And that's why we've decided to deal with this problem in a different way. That is our challenge. If there were to be a feasible way to an acceptable kind of peace that would restore Ukraine's rights, then I think we'd all be in favor. That would be the perfect solution. But this is structurally not possible. It is a very profound challenge for Europe. And also we have to take into account that European and American interests might diverge here. Europe is very much interested, and the US perhaps doesn't even care or doesn't have to care. It's a more strategic question for them that also relates to China. And it's not that I'm judging us, but it is a problem for the Western alliance. I quite liked the question concerning the management of households. That has always been an important topic, and different reforms have been tried.
Man sollte sie alle gleichzeitig verfolgen, aber nicht.
And I think they should still be pursued, although one can't replace the other. To be more concrete, as you said, it is true that individuals, households, don't always have the capacity to manage themselves. They don't always have the understanding. And it should be in everybody's interest to help them. The question is, how can that be forged into a strategy? I would argue that this is a task for the state. The state needs to provide for regulation and protect the citizens. And individual education is one option, but there are limits to it. And then on the question concerning climate policy. Yes, it is true that supporting fossil fuels is not in the interest of climate protection. It's a step into the wrong direction. But again, I don't think we should judge this. It's just tragic. It's a tragic situation that we're stuck in. And the question is, how can we get out of this at the lowest possible costs? Yes, the new policy approach takes away some of the incentives, but I don't think anybody will come out of this crisis thinking that a system based on fossil fuel is the best system. I mean, for some people, it might seem that gas and oil are so essential. But I think people will understand that this is nothing that we can base our future on.
Nicht bis nächsten Frühjahr. Es geht darum, dass niemand friert. Aber über den
I mean, at the moment, the concern is that nobody will freeze in the winter.
kurz- und mittelfrist gegen ihn übereinander
But in the long term, I think it's very clear that working against climate change remains urgent.
200 Euro.
And then about this
Zieht es im
question,
Paket
I think this question about climate change was also about the relief package, that the relief package doesn't really include anything that would help the environment.
Gerne nochmal beim Entlastungspaket
You know, I don't really agree. The relief package, as I said before,
unterstützen.
is to provide targeted assistance.
Wir im Deutschen Bundestag beschließen,
And if we look at the legislation we passed in the German parliament,
dass wir die Energiewende
you will see that the energy transition is still something that we promote, and also at great speed.
dass wir von uns
So I don't really think there's a contradiction or that we've lost our cause.
erwähnen. Das ist das,
You mentioned the CO2 price,
wir auch innerparteilich
and yes,
darüber viel diskutiert haben.
that has very much been a topic of debate also within our party. But we've come to the conclusion that at this very moment where energy has become so incredibly expensive,
Und deswegen haben wir uns
we
dafür
don't want to cause this to exacerbate the crisis. And then I'm not sure I really got your comment
noch eine Antwort sagen.
about the financial allowances and whether they really help people. Sorry, the gentleman speaks off mic and the interpreters can't hear him.
Dass wenn man rechnet, dass einfach mehr des Geldes, das entlastet wird, an die Oberen gehen, die es eigentlich gar nicht brauchen. Und
I said, in fact, there is a bottom-up redistribution.
angesichts der steigenden Preise lächerlich.
And if you hand just 100 or 200 to some people at the lower end, that's not going to change their lives.
Die kalte Progression, der Abbau der kalten Progression noch mit reinnehmen, wenn Sie das
Okay.
rechnen würden, dann gibt es tatsächlich auch
If we don't include coal progression here,
Geringverdiener und Geringverdienerinnen gezielt sind. Wir reden viel zu wenig über die Wohngeldreform.
then
Wir sorgen
we
dafür,
have to say that there's been a lot of support for
dass die Situation kommt, dass sie aus ihrer Wohnung raus.
low-income earners. Let's take the example of the housing allowance or the heating allowance. That was a part of the second relief package.
Vielleicht nicht genug präzise war beim Entlasten.
And perhaps that second package wasn't targeted enough. But as for the third package, I think the Social Democrats really left a mark here.
Das finde ich ein bisschen unglücklich, muss ich jetzt mal sagen.
Now let me comment on the CO2 price. I also think
Wenn man festhält, hätte man das beibehalten sollen und dann lieber.
that the old approach should have been kept.
Aber gleichzeitig würde ich auch sagen, dass an den
But at the same time,
oder langfristigen Transformationsplänen
the medium-term and long-term
diese nichts geändert.
transformation plans or the energy transition plans
Gesagt, dass der
have not been changed or negatively impacted by this crisis.
Es wird vor allen Dingen oben entlastet.
And somebody said we are mainly supporting top earners.
Im Einkommenbereich sich auf.
I mean, we have a lot of households that are somewhere in the middle and who now spend a larger share of their income on energy prices.
Dann aktivieren irgendwann sollten
And once there's going to be the electricity cap,
Entlastung bringen als den
that will also be a relief to the middle-income households.
größeres Haus mehr Energie verwenden, weil
And let's face it, people who earn more money normally have larger houses, and they also pay more for electricity.
ab einer bestimmten Grenze wird es dann super teuer. So, also das möchte ich auch nochmal sagen.
So for them, this will become really expensive.
Aber bei
Now, people keep saying that most of the benefits serve the wealthiest people,
niedrigeren Einkommen.
but I would beg to disagree. There really is a big relief for the lower income groups. Thank
Den
you. I think there was another question,
dritte Meldung gibt.
that young man over there, and then
Die Dame da hinten, genau. Sorry, ich muss so ein
the
bisschen
other two gentlemen, one lady.
frei und ich habe eine weitere. Der Kollege.
Ja, vielen Dank. Kurze Frage. Sie sprechen die ganze
Thank you.
Zeit, dass die Inflation eigentlich von der Angebotsseite getrieben wird.
You were saying that inflation is driven by higher energy prices,
Die Deindustrialisierung abzuwenden,
and you said that we need to avoid deindustrialization.
Inflation gehemmt, weil eben die Kredite
But doesn't the ECB's decision hamper private investment? Thank you. Next question.
Ich bin emeritierter Wirtschaftsprofessor von der FU.
My name is Holt Frerich. I used to be a professor here for economics, and I've always been an opponent of the debt brake. But if Mr. Lindner said that we're going to comply with the debt brake next week, then there are some other clauses to be taken into account. If we expect there's going to be inflation, we'll be allowed to take on more debts.
Diese Bemerkung gerade, dass das Problem der
And coming back to what you just said about energy prices,
die kaum eine Rolle gespielt haben heute Abend,
and we didn't even talk about food prices today.
ausgelöst worden ist.
Much of that crisis was also triggered by COVID on the supply side. Could you please keep your comment brief so that we can all finish in time?
Auf der Angebotsseite muss sehr viel mehr getan.
So much more needs to be done on the supply side in Germany.
Es gibt genug.
Let's just mention fracking. There's plenty of gas in Germany.
Weiterlaufen lassen und so weiter, bis
and then let the nuclear power plants in operation
ist. Und,
as soon as we're able to come up with other solutions. And then there's the war. The war in Ukraine needs to come to an end as fast as possible, not based on negotiations, but by enabling Ukraine with the help of weapons from the West to win this war.
Die Kollegin, und vielleicht machen wir es auch so, ich hatte hier noch eine vierte Frage, das sind bestimmt zwei ganz kurze Fragen.
Thank you. We can have two more questions, and please be brief, and then we take it back to the panel.
Nicht ganz so lang, ich fasse mich kurz.
I will keep it brief. Ines Versbing, I'm the head of the Social Policy Department at the VDK, that we are basically the pensioners lobby organization, and I receive a lot of letters every day from pensioners.
So,
so I'm very much aware of their problems. And I'm a big fan of the relief package. It was a mistake of not considering the pensioners with the second package. And so the third package is an improvement. Now, this has been a relief package, and it's going to take us through the winter. But what's going to happen after that? What are the ideas that we have, apart from taking on more debts or taking on European debts? How do we really solve that question of a social contract? Yes, the housing allowance reform is important, but we can't just hand out this allowance to 7 million households in Germany. So what are potential other ideas that could be applied later? Thank you. The last question.
Ferdinand Ley, britische Botschaft in Berlin.
Thank you. I work at the British Embassy here in Berlin. You talked about the different drivers of inflation, energy prices, labor market development, low interest rates.
Sehen Sie die Inflation?
What this boils down to, let me ask you.
Wirklich weiter allen Ländern eher als
Do you think the increasing inflation is a symptom of a structural development, or is it, let's say, an immediate symptom of the war in Ukraine?
Wir starten mit Herrn Tooze. Sie können dann die erste Frage mit dem Angebotsproblem, die würde ich auch...
Let's start with Mr. Tooze. Perhaps you can comment on the first question. Yes, the supply-demand question is indeed critical. The interest rate increase makes it more expensive to borrow money. But the question is the chronology. Yes, it might hamper new investment. But then on the supply side, we're talking about 2 or 3 years, so it doesn't have relevance right now. The macroeconomic response will be that we want to reduce the demand to cool down the market. I think this last question is very important and also very fundamental. The short answer is the destabilization of global commodity markets, food markets, and also energy markets. All of this did not begin with the war, but it was in full swing as early as last year. And it was a mix of supply shocks, supply chain problems emanating from the COVID crisis, and that should not be underestimated. In the history of humankind, in our economic history, we've never seen a shock like 2020. A collapse of GDP globally of 20% within only a few weeks. That was unprecedented. And it led to major disruptions and also to a very unbalanced recovery of the demand, especially in the spring of last year and especially in Asia. And it was the very fast recovery of China that first destabilized the LNG market. We still haven't recovered from that, and the price spikes we've seen in the summer are now higher than last year in autumn when the Italians already started stabilizing. So it's a real problem. It's long-term in nature. And one solution is the stabilization of the LNG market as we know it from oil. Now, the problem is there isn't actually a global gas market. We have the US domestic market, the Eurasian market, including the Russian pipelines, and then a part of LNG that's dominated by East Asia. And in order to avoid the spikes that we currently have, we need to integrate these markets. That will lead to increased prices in the US when there are sufficient LNG terminals in Mexico, but it will help Europe and Asia. But you could also say that this should not be done because this is bad for climate protection. But that's a European internal perspective. The real question is Pakistan, Bangladesh, and others, how will they get hold of gas in the next 30 years when they're in competition with China, Korea, and others?
Und diese Investitionen sind für eine Stabilisierung dieses Marktes längerfristig sehr wichtig.
But this investment is very important to stabilize this market. It doesn't affect us. We need to pursue our own goal of decarbonizing. But this is not practical in emerging or developing countries. They need that integrated gas market to stabilize because they are the ones that suffer most.
Die Rezession kommt, brauchen wir über eine Schuldenbremse gar nicht mehr nachzudenken.
And then somebody said, when there's a recession, we don't need to worry about the debt break.
Politischen Impuls eben zurückzufahren im nächsten Jahr und man setzt sich vielleicht die Schuldenbremse als Ziel, aber es kann ja viel passieren.
I mean, the debt break is a goal that we have, but there will be a lot of changes, and when there's a recession, it will probably become obsolete.
Unterstützung sehen wie bei Covid, glaube ich zum Beispiel.
But the question is, will we see as much fiscal support next year as we had with COVID? I assume that the government will be more careful, but perhaps you can tell us more. Yes, and this also goes back to the question, what comes next? What are the new ideas? Well, the fact is, I don't think there is an economist in the world who would say that he or she knows what's going to happen. And so it's very hard to say what we will do next. This is a crisis that I personally have never experienced. And yes, and we can criticize the relief packages because they're short-term. But I continue to believe that it will be important to have a strong state that takes supportive action. And yes, of course, you're right that we don't need the debt break or this debt ceiling. Crisis or not, I don't think it is a very helpful instrument. And even with the debt break, we still have discretion. We can, for example, declare a national emergency, as it happened during the COVID crisis. And I think now with all the multiple crises we're facing, we are already in an emergency and should suspend the debt break. But not all politicians agree with me. Let's see what tricks our finance minister will come up with.
Vielleicht noch zu Ihrer Frage zur Angebotsausweitung.
Yes, and concerning your question on increasing
alle Hebel in Bewegung gesetzt werden. Ich glaube,
the supply,
diesen Winter und ich sage es nochmal,
I think we should do whatever we can.
haben wir noch einen Gasspeicher, der noch ganz gut gefüllt ist. Vor allem
As somebody said before, we still have gas in our storage this winter, but next year this situation will become more dire, and then we need every megawatt that we can get, and we shouldn't rule out any options.
Das ist doch ein sehr schönes Schlusswort. Keine Denkverbote zulassen. Ich habe mir so ein bisschen was notiert.
This is a very nice closing remark. So I made some notes. It will get more difficult in the future. We need to act in a sovereign way at a German and European level. We don't need revolution, but structural changes, strong states, a strong economy. Well, these are all the buzzwords that we have heard, and if we went into detail, this would be getting even more complex. I would like to thank you for joining us today, and I would like to thank our audience today. So on behalf of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, I can invite you to have a little snack with us. So some of the guests will stay and you can continue your discussions. Thank you very much for coming and have a great evening.